the crackle of the fire, the vast, silent wilderness. Camping promises escape, but sometimes what you're escaping from follows you into the woods, or worse, was already waiting there. Welcome, fellow campers, to Nightmare True Horror. Tonight, we venture into the wild with 4 true accounts where the serenity of nature was shattered by unimaginable terror. What unseen eyes have you felt watching from the tree line? What unexplained sounds have broken the campsite's quiet? Share your own chilling outdoor encounters in the comments. If the thought of what truly lurks beyond the firelight sends a shiver down your spine, stake your claim with us. A subscription ensures you're never alone in the dark. Tip up your tents. Extinguish all but the faintest glow. For these are not just tales of the wild, but of the darkness within it, and the most terrifying discoveries often await when you're furthest from help. Right until the break of a very hours. Unwelcome, the scraping sound of metal on stone echoed through the darkness as we pulled into the remote campground at 11:30 p.m. Our headlights cutting through the dense Colorado wilderness like knives through black velvet. I'd been driving for 9 hours straight. My girlfriend Emma asleep in the passenger seat. Her brother Jake snoring softly in the back. This was supposed to be our perfect weekend getaway. 3 days of hiking and disconnecting from the digital world at Pine Ridge Campground, a primitive site 40 miles from the nearest cell tower. As I turned off the engine, the scraping stopped abruptly, leaving only the whisper of wind through towering ponderosa pines. The silence felt wrong, too complete, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I scanned the tree line with our headlights, but saw nothing except twisted shadows that seemed to shift and move independently of the breeze. The smell of pine sap was overwhelming, mixed with something metallic that made my stomach clench. As I reached over to wake Emma, a sharp crack echoed from the darkness behind our car. The unmistakable sound of a heavy footstep on dry branches. The question that froze my blood was simple. If this campground was supposed to be empty, who was walking around out there in the middle of the night? My name is David Torres, and I'm a 31-year-old paramedic from Denver with 15 years of wilderness experience. Emma and Jake have been planning this trip for months, a chance to escape their stressful jobs and reconnect with nature. Jake, a software engineer, had found this place online, advertised as pristine backcountry camping for serious outdoors enthusiasts. The site promised complete isolation, no facilities, and no other campers. It was exactly what we'd been looking for. The campground consisted of 4 designated sites, scattered across a small meadow, surrounded by dense forest. We brought everything we needed. A 3-season tent, sleeping bags, and enough food for 3 days. What we hadn't brought was any way to call for help if something went wrong. The nearest town was a 2-hour drive down winding mountain roads that became treacherous in the dark. I chose site number 2 because it offered good visibility of the meadow and access to the creek for water. As we unloaded our gear by flashlight, Emma noticed something disturbing about the trees surrounding our campsite. Deep, fresh gouges in the bark formed crude symbols. Not random scratches from wildlife, but deliberate markings that looked like warnings. Some were carved so recently that sap still oozed from the wounds, gleaming like blood in our flashlight beams. "Look at this," Jake whispered, pointing to a massive pine where someone had carved 3 parallel lines crossed by a jagged X. Below it, barely visible in the bark, were scratched letters. Mine. The markings weren't random. As I examined them more closely, I realized they formed a rough circle around our chosen campsite, like a territorial boundary. The metallic smell I noticed earlier was stronger here, mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the morgue where I'd worked during my EM training. By the time we had our tent pitched, it was nearly 1 a.m. The temperature had dropped into the 20s, and our breath came out in visible puffs. As Jake built our fire, I heard the first wire snap. A sharp twang of tension metal suddenly released, followed by something heavy crashing through the underbrush about 30 yards away. The sound was unmistakable to someone with my medical background. The wet thud of a large animal hitting the ground hard, followed by desperate thrashing that gradually weakened to nothing. Whatever had triggered that snare was now dead, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. What was that? Emma whispered, her face pale in the firelight. Before I could answer, Jake's flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a low branch just outside our fire's glow was a collection of driver's licenses, zip-tied together and swaying gently in the breeze. I recognized the format, Colorado licenses, but from different years, different people. My paramedic training kicked in as I counted them. 7 licenses, all featuring young people who looked like they'd been camping or hiking when their photos were taken. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't the first campers to ignore the warnings carved into these trees. We'd walked into a trap, and whoever had set it collected trophies from his victims. That's when I heard the voice calling from the darkness. Rough and gravelly, like someone who hadn't spoken to another human being in years. You should have read the signs. Now you're a part of my collection. A tall figure emerged from the tree line, moving with the confident gait of someone who knew every root and rock in these woods. He was probably in his 50s, with wild gray hair and clothes that looked like they'd been patched together from other campers' gear. His eyes reflected our firelight like an animal's, and his hands were stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. 20 years I've been protecting this place, he said conversationally, as if we were old friends. 20 years of keeping people like you from ruining what's left of the real wilderness. You come up here with your fancy gear and your city attitudes, thinking you can just take whatever you want. He pulled out a hunting knife with a serrated edge, its blade gleaming in the firelight. Around his neck hung a cord strung with what looked like finger bones. More trophies from his victims. But this is my home now, and I don't like visitors. My paramedic training had taught me to stay calm in crisis situations, but this was beyond anything I'd encountered. Jake grabbed a burning branch from our fire, swinging it like a club, while Emma backed toward the creek. The man laughed, a sound like grinding glass. You can't run, he said. I know every trail, every hiding spot, and I've got friends waiting in the woods. Friends who don't like strangers either. That's when I remembered the emergency flare gun in our gear. As he lunged forward with the knife, I dove for our pack, my fingers closing around the flare gun's grip. The man was fast, but I was faster. I fired the flare directly at his chest, the bright red projectile hitting him center mass and igniting his patched clothing. He screamed and stumbled backward, beating at the flames, giving us the seconds we needed to grab our packs and run into the darkness. We ran blindly through the forest, following the creek bed because it was the only landmark we could identify in the darkness. Behind us, I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, no longer trying to be silent. The flare had burned out, but his clothes were still smoldering, and I could smell the acrid smoke following us through the trees. Jake tripped over a hidden wire, triggering another snare that snapped shut inches from his face. We were running through a maze of booby traps, each one designed to maim or kill. My medical training helped me spot the subtle signs: disturbed earth, unnatural arrangements of branches, the glint of metal wire in our flashlight beams. It took us 4 hours of careful navigation to reach the logging road where we'd left our car. The man's screams had faded into the distance, but I knew he was still out there, still hunting us. We drove straight to the nearest police station, our story tumbling out in a breathless rush. The search team that went back to Pine Ridge found our abandoned campsite, the collection of driver's licenses, and evidence of booby traps scattered throughout the forest. They also found the remains of at least 6 campers buried in shallow graves around the campground. People who'd come to enjoy the wilderness and never returned home. But they never found the man who'd attacked us. The FBI classified him as a serial killer, possibly a military veteran with survival training who'd been living off the grid for decades. Pine Ridge Campground was permanently closed, but that doesn't stop people from trying to find it. I don't camp anymore. The thought of sleeping in a tent, surrounded by darkness and unknown sounds, sends me into panic attacks that leave me gasping for breath. Emma and Jake moved to different cities, unable to look at Forrest without remembering that night. But what haunts me most isn't the memory of his knife or the smell of burning flesh when the flare hit him. It's something I found in my mailbox last month. A single photograph of a campsite I didn't recognize, taken from the tree line at night. In the foreground, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall figure watching a tent, and on the back, Written in the same crude lettering as the tree carvings was a simple message: still protecting the wilderness. The question that keeps me awake at night is simple. How many other remote campsites have territorial markers carved into the trees? And how many other collectors are out there, waiting patiently for the next group of campers to ignore the warnings? If that tale from the campfire's edge sent a shiver down your spine, just wait. When the stars come out, another true account of terror in the great outdoors is waiting to be uncovered. The first drops of October rain began pattering against the maple leaves above our heads, as my boyfriend Jake and I pushed deeper into the Adirondack wilderness, following a trail that had grown increasingly faint over the past hour. What had started as a perfect autumn hiking day was rapidly turning into a soggy nightmare, with storm clouds gathering overhead and the temperature dropping fast enough to make our breath visible in small puffs. That's when I heard it, a soft creaking sound from somewhere ahead, rhythmic and deliberate, like a door swinging back and forth in the wind. The sound was too regular to be natural, too purposeful to be random forest noise. I stopped walking and listened, but the creaking faded just as the rain began falling harder. Through the dense pine trees ahead, I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. A dark structure partially hidden by undergrowth, its roofline barely visible through the forest canopy. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us from behind those dark windows, studying our approach with predatory interest. My name is Sarah Williams, and I'm a 26-year-old nurse from Albany who'd been dating Jake Morrison for 8 months. He was an experienced hiker who'd promised me a beautiful day exploring some of the more remote trails in the Adirondack Park. It was October 2023, and we'd driven 3 hours north to tackle a challenging trail that Jake claimed would show me the real wilderness away from the tourist crowds. The structure turned out to be a small log cabin, maybe 20 feet square, nestled in a clearing that had been partially reclaimed by forest growth. It looked abandoned, moss growing on the roof, windows dark and grimy, no signs of recent habitation, but it was dry shelter. And with rain now falling steadily, it seemed like a gift from heaven. Perfect timing, Jake said, shouldering his pack and heading for the front door. We can wait out the storm and then finish the loop trail. But something about the cabin felt wrong from the moment we approached. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within, and there were no obvious trails leading to or from the structure. Most troubling, I could smell something unpleasant. Not the musty odor of an old building, but something organic and wrong that made my stomach clench. Jake pushed the door open and stepped inside, calling back, "It's dry in here. Looks like it's been empty for years." But as I followed him into the dim interior, my eyes began adjusting to reveal details that made my skin crawl. The cabin wasn't just abandoned. It showed signs of hasty departure. A table was overturned, chairs scattered, and dark stains marked the wooden floor in patterns that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Jake," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "We shouldn't be here. It's just an old hunting cabin," he replied, but his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. Probably been empty since the 80s. Yet, the evidence suggested more recent occupation. Empty food cans with dates from last year, fresh scratches on the walls, and most disturbing, what looked like rope marks on one of the wooden support posts, as if someone had been tied there. In the corner, partially hidden under a moth-eaten blanket, I found a collection of personal items that made my blood freeze. Driver's licenses, credit cards, and jewelry, all belonging to different women, all arranged like trophies in a cardboard box. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this." He came over and examined the box, his face going pale as he recognized what we'd discovered. "Sarah, we need to leave. Right now." But the rain outside had intensified into a full thunderstorm, with lightning flashing and wind howling through the trees. Leaving the cabin meant hiking for hours in dangerous conditions, while staying meant occupying what appeared to be a crime scene. As we debated our options, I noticed more disturbing details. Scratches on the walls that looked like fingernail marks, a chain and padlock attached to one corner of the room, most horrifying Polaroid photographs scattered under debris, images of women who appeared to be unconscious or worse, taken in this very cabin. Someone's been using this place to hurt people, I said, the full horror of our situation becoming clear. This isn't an abandoned cabin. It's where someone brings victims. Jake was examining the photographs with the grim focus of someone trying to understand a crime scene. Some of these look recent, Sarah. Within the past few months, the implication hit us both simultaneously. If this place was still being used, the person responsible might return. We were trapped in a predator's lair during a storm that prevented us from leaving. That's when we heard footsteps on the cabin's front porch. Jake and I froze, listening to the distinctive sound of boots on wet wooden planks. Someone was outside, approaching the door with the confident stride of someone familiar with the location. "Quick," Jake whispered, pointing toward what appeared to be a back room. "Hide." We crept into the rear section of the cabin, which turned out to be even more disturbing than the main room. The smell here was overwhelming. Decay mixed with chemicals that suggested someone had been trying to clean up evidence. Plastic sheeting covered the floor, and power tools sat on a makeshift table. Through a crack in the door, I could see into the main room as a figure entered the cabin. A man in his 50s, wearing hunting gear and carrying a large duffel bag, moved through the space with practiced familiarity. He checked various locations methodically, like someone conducting inventory. But what terrified me most was his reaction to our presence. He wasn't surprised to find evidence that someone had been in the cabin. He was pleased. "I know you're in here," he called out in a conversational tone. "Saw your footprints in the mud outside. 2 people, hiking boots, one smaller set, probably female." He set down his duffel bag and began unpacking items that made my stomach lurch. Sip teas, duct tape, surgical instruments, and a small video camera. "This is perfect timing," he continued, moving closer to our hiding spot. "I was coming up here to do some cleaning, but fresh visitors are so much more interesting than maintenance work." Jake grabbed my hand and pointed toward a small window in the back room. It was our only escape route, but it meant going outside into the storm and trying to navigate through wilderness in the dark. The man's footsteps approached our door. "I've been using this cabin for 7 years now. Brought lots of people here for extended visits. Some stayed longer than others, depending on how cooperative they were." He was describing a serial killer's operational base, a place where he brought victims for torture and murder. We'd stumbled into his hunting preserve, and now we were his next targets. "Come out now, and I'll make this quick," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Hide from me, and I'll take my time. Your choice," Jake whispered. "On 3, we go through the window and run north toward the main trail." But as we prepared to flee, I heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of sirens approaching through the forest. Not just one vehicle, but multiple units, growing louder by the minute. The killer heard them too, his confident demeanor cracked, replaced by panic and rage. "Goddamn hikers must have called this in," he muttered, rapidly repacking his equipment. Through the window, I could see emergency vehicles approaching on what must have been an access road we hadn't noticed. State police cars, ambulances, and what looked like federal agents were converging on the clearing. The man realized his time was up. Instead of continuing to hunt for us, he grabbed his bag and headed for the back door, disappearing into the forest just as law enforcement surrounded the cabin. It turned out that Jake had activated a GPS beacon when we first found the disturbing evidence, alerting park authorities to our location and the potential crime scene. The FBI had been looking for this cabin for months, following leads related to missing hikers and campers throughout the region. The investigation revealed that Robert Marsh had been using the remote cabin to kidnap and murder at least 12 people over 7 years. The victims were mostly solo hikers and couples who'd become lost or sought shelter during bad weather. Marsh was arrested 3 days later at a motel in Vermont, but the psychological impact of our experience lasted much longer. The knowledge that we'd been minutes away from becoming his next victims, that we'd been trapped in his killing ground while he planned our deaths, fundamentally changed how I view wilderness recreation. The items we'd found in the cabin belonged to his victims, trophies he'd collected from people who'd trusted the wrong shelter during a storm. Some of the women in the photographs were never identified, suggesting his crimes extended beyond what investigators could prove. 6 months later, I received a letter forwarded through the state police. No return address. postmarked from the maximum security prison where Marsh is serving multiple life sentences. Inside was a hand-drawn map of hiking trails throughout New England, with small cabins marked at various locations. At the bottom, he'd written, "Still have lots of safe places to wait out storms, Sarah. Still thinking about visitors who appreciate good hospitality. Because some predators never stop hunting, even from behind bars. They just adapt their methods, share their knowledge with others, and wait for opportunities to resume their work. And somewhere in the vast wilderness areas of America, other remote cabins are waiting. Other storms are building, and other predators are preparing shelter for the next hikers who trust the wrong refuge from the rain. The next time you're caught in a storm and find the perfect cabin offering shelter, remember that some hosts are more dangerous than the weather you're trying to escape. Because sometimes the most welcoming shelters are the ones that never let you leave. Don't let the beauty of nature fool you." There's another chapter of real-life dread from the darkest corners of the campsite we need to explore together. The sound that woke me at 3:47 a.m. wasn't quite right for the Adirondack wilderness. Too deliberate, too rhythmic, to be an animal foraging through the underbrush. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to what sounded like careful footsteps circling our campsite, stopping every few seconds as if someone was studying our setup from different angles. My girlfriend Jess was still asleep beside me, but I could feel my heart hammering as the footsteps moved closer to our tent. The sound stopped directly outside our rain fly, and I held my breath, waiting. Then came a soft scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across nylon fabric, followed by absolute silence that felt more terrifying than any sound. Who was out there in the middle of nowhere? And why were they studying our campsite like they were planning something? I'm Mike Chen, 28, a software engineer from Albany, who'd been backpacking with my girlfriend Jess for the past 2 years. We'd driven up to the High Peaks region for a long weekend, planning to hike the Algonquin Peak Trail and camp at one of the designated sites along Lake Colden. It was early October, peak foliage season, which meant the trails were busier than usual, but the nights were getting cold enough to thin out the casual campers. We'd arrived at our campsite around 4 in the afternoon, a small clearing about 50 yards from the lake shore. The site was perfect, level ground, established fire ring, and enough trees to provide wind protection. We'd set up our tent, cooked dinner over our portable stove, and fallen asleep to the sound of lapping water and rustling leaves. But something had changed during the night. I unzipped our tent fly slightly and peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the outline of trees and our camp gear. Everything looked normal, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I grabbed my headlamp and phone, quietly slipped out of the tent, and did a quick perimeter check. That's when I saw the footprints, clear boot impressions in the soft dirt around our tent. Too large to be Jess's, too fresh to be from other campers. Someone had been circling our site, studying our setup, getting close enough to touch our tent. The prints led away from our campsite toward a cluster of pines about 100 yards to the west. I followed the trail with my headlamp, fighting every instinct that told me to stay put. The prints were easy to track in the damp earth, leading through the trees to another clearing I hadn't noticed when we'd arrived. That's where I found the abandoned campsite. It was fully set up and looked expensive. A large North Face four-season tent, high-end sleeping bags visible through the mesh door, a camp stove, water bottles, even a portable camp chair. But everything was wrong. The tent door was wide open. The sleeping bags were half pulled out like someone had left in a hurry, and there was no sign of whoever had been camping there. A cold campfire ring sat in the center of the site, the ashes soggy from the previous night's dew. I knelt down and touched the charred wood. It was completely cold, meaning this fire had been out for at least 12 hours. But all the gear was still here, expensive equipment that no serious backpacker would abandon. Inside the tent, I found a cell phone wedged between two sleeping bags. The screen was cracked but functional, and when I pressed the home button, it lit up showing dozens of missed calls and text messages. The last activity was a video recorded at 11:43 p.m. the previous night. I pressed play and watched the screen fill with a shaky image of the tent's interior. The person holding the phone was whispering urgently, "Something's wrong. I keep hearing footsteps outside, but When I look out, there's nothing there. Sarah went to use the bathroom an hour ago and she hasn't come back. I called her name, but the video jumped as the person obviously heard something outside. The whispering became more frantic. Someone is out there. They keep circling the campsite. They're not an animal. The footsteps are too regular, too deliberate. Oh God, I think they're coming back. The camera showed a brief glimpse of a bearded man in his 30s, eyes wide with terror, before swinging back toward the tent door. That's when I heard it, even through the phone's tiny speaker, the sound of a tent zipper being violently torn open. The man screamed, the phone went flying, and the video cut to black. My hands were shaking as I stared at the dead screen. This had happened less than 24 hours ago, maybe while Jess and I were driving up here. I looked around the abandoned campsite with new eyes, noticing details I'd missed before. The sleeping bags weren't just pulled out, they were torn. Dark stains on the tent floor that looked suspiciously like dried blood. And most disturbing, drag marks in the dirt leading away from the tent toward the dense woods. I had to get back to Jess immediately. I turned to run back to our campsite, but that's when I heard them. The same deliberate footsteps I'd heard earlier, but closer now, coming from multiple directions. Someone had been watching me explore the abandoned site. They'd followed me here, and now they were surrounding me. I clicked off my headlamp and crouched behind a tree, trying to control my breathing. Through the darkness, I could see shapes moving between the trees. At least 3 figures, possibly more, coordinating their movements like they'd done this before. They were herding me away from the path back to our campsite, forcing me deeper into the woods. That's when I understood what had happened to the couple who'd been camping here. This wasn't random. Someone was hunting campers in this area, using the isolation and darkness to their advantage. The expensive gear left behind wasn't abandoned. It was bait, meant to lure curious campers like me away from safety. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but there was no signal this deep in the wilderness. The shapes were getting closer, and I could hear them communicating in low whispers. Professional, organized, patient. They'd done this before. I made a desperate decision to run, crashing through the underbrush toward where I thought our campsite was located. Behind me, the footsteps erupted into pursuit. No more stealth, just the sound of multiple people running through the forest. I could hear branches snapping, heavy breathing, and worst of all, voices calling out coordinates like they were running a military operation. He's heading southeast toward the lake. One voice shouted, "Cut him off at the trail junction." I burst into our campsite screaming Jess's name, but our tent was empty. Her sleeping bag was cold, her boots were gone, and there was no sign of struggle. Either she'd left voluntarily, or they'd already taken her. The footsteps were getting closer. I grabbed our emergency satellite beacon and activated it, then ran toward the lake, hoping the open water would give me options. Behind me, I could hear them searching our campsite, going through our gear, coordinating their next move. I spent the next 4 hours hiding in the reeds along the lakeshore, listening to them hunt for me in the darkness. They knew the area intimately, checking every hiding spot with systematic precision. Just before dawn, I heard helicopters approaching, and the sound of the hunters retreating deeper into the woods. The rescue team found me hypothermic and babbling about hunters and abandoned campsites. They located the site I'd described, but it had been completely cleaned out. No tent, no gear, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. The police said I was probably suffering from exposure and stress, that I'd imagined the whole thing, but they never found Jess, or Sarah and her boyfriend from the video, or the other missing campers that the investigation eventually connected to this area over the past 3 years. Detective Williams privately admitted they suspected organized human trafficking, using popular camping areas to identify and abduct isolated victims. The wilderness provided perfect cover, no witnesses, no cell service, plenty of places to dispose of evidence. I never went camping again, but sometimes I'll get a call in the middle of the night from an unknown number. When I answer, all I hear is the sound of footsteps circling in the darkness, patient and deliberate, like someone's still hunting, and they remember exactly where I live. The reality of these encounters in the remote wilderness is often more terrifying than fiction. And the next story is a stark, true reminder of just that. The air in the Okanagan National Forest tastes like pine and freedom. My girlfriend, Clara, and I were 2 weeks into a cross-country camping trip, a final soul-cleansing adventure before surrendering to grad school and real life. Our campsite was a perfect little pocket of solitude, miles down a winding dirt road, nestled by a crystal-clear creek. We were low on firewood. As we were setting up our tent, a beat-up pickup truck, laden with freshly split logs, rumbled up the road. The driver, a friendly-looking man in his 50s, with a sun-weathered face and a genuine, easy smile, offered to sell us a bundle. "Best oak in the county," he said, his voice a pleasant, gravelly baritone. Burned slow and hot, he helped us unload the wood, stacking it neatly by the fire pit. As he finished, he gestured to a large, oddly shaped piece at the bottom of the pile. It was thicker than the others, and wrapped in what looked like dark, weathered bark. "Save that one for last," he said with a conspiratorial wink. "It's a special one, a real good night ender." He tipped his hat, refused our offer of a cold drink, and drove off, leaving us to the profound silence of the woods. That night, as the fire crackled and spit, casting dancing shadows against the tall pines, I felt a strange sense of unease. I heard a faint, muffled thump from the direction of the woodpile. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Clara. She looked up from the book she was reading by the firelight. "Hear what? The fire?" "No, it was different." I stared into the darkness beyond our campsite. The woods, which had felt so peaceful an hour ago, now seemed to be pressing in, watchful and menacing. It was nothing, I told myself. A log settling, an animal in the underbrush. But why did I have this sudden chilling feeling that we weren't alone? The special log was a source of low-level dread that I couldn't quite articulate. It sat at the bottom of the pile, and every time my gaze drifted toward it, a cold knot would tighten in my stomach. Its bark wasn't right. It didn't look like wood. It was too uniform, too smooth, with a faint, crisscrossing pattern I could just barely make out in the firelight when I accidentally nudged it with my boot. It didn't feel solid like a log. It felt dense, pliable. "You're being weird about that log," Clara said, laughing at me. "It's just a piece of wood." But I couldn't shake the feeling. The man's words echoed in my head. A special one. It felt less like a friendly tip and more like a command, a piece of foreshadowing in a story I didn't want to be in. The paranoia grew. I found myself scanning the dark tree line, my heart jumping at every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl. The friendly man who had sold us the wood now felt like a character from a nightmare, his easy smile a predatory mask. We ate our dinner in a tense silence. The fire, which should have been a comfort, now felt like a stage, illuminating us for an unseen audience. I tried to convince Clara that we should pack up and leave. "Because of a weird-looking log?" she asked, her voice a mixture of amusement and concern. "You're exhausted. The city has made you forget what the wilderness sounds like." Maybe she was right. I was letting my imagination get the better of me. This was our last night here. I needed to relax, to enjoy the solitude I had craved. The fire began to die down, the glowing embers pulsing like a dying heart. The temperature started to drop. "We need more wood," Clara said, oblivious to the storm raging inside. Before I could stop her, she walked to the woodpile. "Let's see what's so special about this one," she said, grabbing the oddly shaped log. She was right. It was heavy. It took both of her hands to lift it as she carried it toward the fire. The heat washed over it, and a smell, faint at first, then stronger, filled the air. It wasn't the clean, earthy scent of oak. It was a foul, coppery, organic smell. The smell of a slaughterhouse. Clara dropped it by the edge of the fire pit. "God, what is that?" she choked out, her hand flying to her mouth. The heat from the embers began to warm the log, and as it did, we saw that it wasn't bark covering it. It was a tightly bound, thick canvas sack, stained dark with something that had long since dried, and it began to move. It was a small movement at first, a twitch, a slight undulation, as if something inside was slowly, sluggishly waking up. The canvas began to smolder where it was closest to the embers, and the foul smell intensified. Then came a sound, a low, wet, gurgling sound from within the sack. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing, but the terror was absolute. This wasn't a log. It was a coffin, and the thing inside was beginning to cook. Clara screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. We scrambled backward, away from the fire, away from the horrifying, moving thing at its edge. The canvas sack jerked again, more violently this time. That's when a new sound cut through the night. The sound of a twig snapping behind us. We spun around. Standing at the edge of our campsite, just beyond the ring of firelight, was the friendly man from the pickup truck. He was holding a long, heavy axe, and he was smiling his easy, genuine smile. "I see you saved the special one for last," he said, his voice calm and pleasant. "I was hoping you would. The anticipation is the best part." He took a slow step toward us. He hadn't been selling firewood. He had been delivering a trap. The log wasn't meant for the fire. It was bait. He was waiting for us to discover it, to be paralyzed by the horror of it. And then he would begin his real work. We didn't scream. We didn't think. We ran. We plunged into the dark, unforgiving woods. Branches tearing at our faces. Our lungs burning with cold air and terror. We could hear him behind us. His footsteps not frantic, but steady and relentless. The sound of a man who knew the woods, who knew his prey had nowhere to go. We stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours, finally bursting onto the main road, where we flagged down a passing truck, our frantic, hysterical story making no sense to the bewildered driver. The police found the campsite. They found the smoldering canvas sack by the fire. The official report said it contained unidentifiable biological material. They found the axe, but the man, the friendly man with the easy smile, was gone. He had melted back into the wilderness that was his hunting ground. We live in the city now, a world of concrete and steel, as far from the deep woods as we can get. I can't be around a bonfire. The smell of burning wood sends me into a full-blown panic attack. Last week, a package was delivered to our apartment. A long, narrow box. There was no return address. Inside, nestled on a bed of wood shavings, was a single, freshly sharpened axe head. Tucked under the blade was a small, neatly printed note. "You forgot your party favor."